In this lesson, we are going to study how neurons communicate with each other. So how do neurons communicate with other neurons? The short answer is that it uses chemical signals between neurons. For example, if you prick your hand with a pin, how does your brain know that you've touched something and that it hurts? Well, this is the pain pathway. When you prick your finger, first, sensory neuron sends information to another neuron. The sensory neuron is long. It goes all the way from your fingertip to the spinal cord. It connects right here to this purple neuron here called the interneuron, which connects to a motor neuron. So here there are three neurons: sensory, interneuron, and motor neuron. And this causes a reflex for your finger to move without anything coming from your brain. Your brain doesn't even have to think about it, and you will move. Sensory neuron also connects to a projection neuron, which travels up the spinal cord and into the thalamus and into the upper cortex. It connects to the parietal lobe where touch is processed. And that's how your brain knows that your finger has been pricked. So as you can see, neurons need to connect to other neurons to send information. So how is this information relayed from one neuron to the next? Basically, there are two ways. The first is that there's an electrical signal that happens inside one neuron. But to communicate with the next neuron, this signal needs to convert or change into a chemical signal. Synaptic transmission is when neurons communicate to another neuron. During synaptic transmission, chemicals, these red dots, called neurotransmitters, are released from one neuron and they bind to receptor proteins, these blue dots here, on another neuron. These proteins are blue. So these are the chemicals. Neurotransmitters are the chemicals that communicate between one neuron to another. Let's look at the process of how two neurons communicate to each other in detail. Here is where chemical signaling happens in the space between two neurons. Here's neuron number 1 and neuron number 2. The first neuron is called the presynaptic cell. And the space here in between the neurons is called the synapse. Pre means before, so before the synapse. And neuron number 2 is called the postsynaptic cell. Post means after. Here are the characters or the important molecules involved. These are synaptic vesicles. They're kind of like little bags that hold neurotransmitters inside. And this is an action potential, which is electrical signaling that comes down the neuron. The green here are proteins on the membrane. They are sensitive to calcium. They open and allow calcium to enter. And these are calcium-sensitive proteins. These proteins will respond when calcium comes into the cell. Finally, this purple protein is called a reuptake transporter. This will meaning repeat, uptake, take up, so it will take up neurotransmitters later. And here, these are receptors. They are proteins on the postsynaptic cell, and they receive the signal, or they receive the neurotransmitters. Here's how it happens. First, an action potential or an electrical signaling comes down the neuron. Then, these calcium channels open, And what do you think will happen when calcium channels open? That's right, calcium will get into the cell. And when calcium gets into the cell, the calcium-sensitive proteins will bring these vesicles, these little bags of neurotransmitters, to the membrane. And neurotransmitters will be released into the synapse or the synaptic cleft. And they will bind to receptors or proteins on the postsynaptic cell. So these receptors receive this chemical signal. And once they bind, ion channels will open on the postsynaptic membrane, and ions will get into the cell. And a new electric signal will be generated. And finally, extra neurotransmitters or excess neurotransmitters are degraded, or they are brought back into the presynaptic cell.